to take root, pushing for a more reasoned, empirical approach to understanding the universe. Church and secular institutions. The growing influence of the Renaissance led to a shift in the intellectual landscape. Humanism promoted the study of classical texts, while advances in mathematics and the observation of the natural world challenged medieval dogmas. Astrology's influence. Forecasting political events. The Royal Academy of Sciences, founded in 1666 in Paris, was a key institution in the battle against astrology's credibility. The Academy was part of a broader effort to elevate empirical science, which led to direct confrontations with astrologers. As part of its broader mission, the Royal Academy sought to study the natural world in a systematic, testable way, drawing from observations and experiments, rejecting older, interpretive methods like astrology. One of the central figures at the Royal Academy was Jean-Baptiste Morin, an astrologer who sought to defend astrology as a scientific discipline. His work was influential, but it became the subject of intense scrutiny from empirical scientists. Astrology as unverifiable and unfounded. Shift towards skepticism. In England, the Royal Society, founded in 1660, also took a strong stance against astrology. Members like Robert Hooke and Isaac Newton spearheaded efforts to apply empirical methods and test astrological claims. The Royal Society was founded on the idea that scientific knowledge must be derived from experiment and observation, which placed them in direct conflict with astrologers who relied on ancient traditions and unverifiable predictions. Older, irrational age cemented empirical science as the dominant worldview. The rejection of astrology by leading figures in the Royal Society marked the beginning of its intellectual decline in the scientific community. The focus shifted entirely to mathematics, physics, and natural philosophy. At the same time, France saw the emergence of public astrology debates between Morin and his opponents, including skeptics like Pierre Gassendi, who argued that astrology had no empirical basis and was based on superstition. Claims appear unscientific. And secularism, which were taking root in Europe during the Enlightenment. The 17th century was also the era of the early Enlightenment, with philosophers like John Locke and Baruch Spinoza promoting reason as the only valid path to knowledge, further undermining astrology's credibility. In France, while Morin remained an influential figure, astrology continued to lose favor in the academic and royal courts. The rise of empirical science and skepticism led to a more secular intellectual environment. By the late 17th century, the Royal Society became one of the leading institutions in Europe promoting skepticism about astrology. Its members were committed to empirical methods, and their critiques were part of a larger cultural movement to cast off medieval superstitions. Failed to provide verifiable results. Claims of astrology. Newton's later writings, which included his early work on alchemy, made him aware of astrology's claims, but he ultimately came to see it as unscientific, emphasizing that predictions must be based on observable phenomena. At the same time, critiques of astrology were not limited to scientific figures. Writers, poets, and public intellectuals also began to denounce astrology in the broader cultural discourse, linking it with irrationality and backward thinking. Astrologers in the public eye. The Royal Society's stance on astrology was influential, and its members' collective rejection of astrology contributed to the gradual decline of astrological belief in mainstream European society. One of the most vocal critics of astrology within the Royal Society was John Wilkins, an early member and advocate of the scientific method. Wilkins believed that astrology had no grounding in the observable universe and could not stand up to the scrutiny of scientific experimentation. Influenced earthly events of the Royal Society's skepticism. Scientific community at the time. Gassendi. The results were heavily skewed against astrology. Pierre Gassendi, a prominent critic of astrology and a leading scientific figure in France, argued that celestial bodies could not exert any influence on human affairs. His work laid the foundation for a more materialistic and mechanistic understanding of the universe. Gassendi's rejection of astrology was part of a broader philosophical shift toward a naturalistic view of the universe. He argued that the cosmos operated according to fixed laws of motion, and that human events were not subject to celestial influence. Another key figure in the critique of astrology was Isaac Newton. Although he never formally published on astrology, his deep involvement with empirical science left little room for astrology, which he considered a pseudoscience. Newton's refusal to engage with astrology reflected the broader shift in intellectual thought during the Enlightenment, where rationalism and the scientific method were becoming dominant forces. His Astrologia Gallica * fell short of convincing the scientific community. Scientific institutions of the universe with rational, testable hypotheses, unverifiable claims, empirically verified. By the end of the century, astrology was no longer considered a legitimate academic discipline. It had been supplanted by the rapidly growing fields of physics, chemistry, and biology, all of which emphasized empirical evidence and reproducibility. Prominence. But its credibility as a science was gone. The 18th century marked the final stage in astrology's decline as a serious academic discipline. Enlightenment thinkers, especially in the fields of science and philosophy, paved the way for a new era of rationalism and empiricism. Its earlier academic roots. Original empirical claims. Its predictive powers. Jung's interest in astrology contributed to its lasting cultural relevance, as he interpreted astrology as a symbolic language, linking it with the unconscious mind and human archetypes. The Royal Society played a crucial role in shaping public perception of astrology. By subjecting astrology to scientific scrutiny, it framed the discussion in a way that made it increasingly difficult to accept as a legitimate discipline. In its early years, the Royal Society's members were not wholly dismissive of astrology. Some, like Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton, showed interest in astrology's potential, but over time, the majority of the Society's members shifted to skepticism, influenced by empirical research and scientific rigor. Although astrology continued to hold sway in the public imagination, especially in royal courts, its role as a tool for scientific inquiry was increasingly viewed as a superstition. By the late 17th century, it had lost much of its academic respectability. Rational, enlightened future of the Enlightenment. Rational thought, setting the stage for its eventual relegation to pseudoscience. In empirical observation and experiment, whereas astrology continued to rely on untestable beliefs. Movement of celestial bodies without invoking astrological influences. As science began to dominate, the public's appetite for rational explanations of the world grew. This shift was fueled by Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire, who mocked astrology as a relic of ignorant superstition, held to promote the new scientific worldview, increasingly seen as incompatible with these new scientific standards. The decline of astrology coincided with the rise of a materialistic view of the universe, one where human existence and celestial events were seen as governed by natural laws rather than mystical forces. By the 18th century, astrology was relegated to the margins of intellectual life. While it still had a strong following among the public, its status as a serious academic discipline was gone. The scientific revolution had conclusively replaced astrology with evidence-based science. While astrology's credibility as a science was lost, it found new life in the 19th century as part of the growing fascination with mysticism and the occult. Figures like Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society helped revive astrology as a spiritual practice, as a valuable tool for self-exploration. In the early 20th century, astrology experienced a resurgence as part of the New Age movement, which embraced a variety of esoteric practices. It became increasingly divorced from its early scientific roots, focusing instead on personal growth and spiritual insight. Apps have become a staple of modern life and offer a sense of control over an uncertain future. The story of astrology's decline from the scientific stage is a tale of how human knowledge evolves. From being a respected academic discipline to a fringe belief, astrology's journey mirrors the rise of scientific rationalism and the shifting boundaries of human understanding. Despite its fall from grace in academic circles, astrology remains an enduring cultural phenomenon. It speaks to human curiosity, our desire for meaning, and the search for patterns in an unpredictable world.